But it is also a pleasure to welcome to the program Representative Kathy McMorris-Rodgers, the member of Congress who represents Washington State's 5th Congressional District. And Congresswoman McMorris-Rodgers, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks, Lars. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you on the program, and I'm so glad to see that, given your unique circumstances in your family, that you were willing to vote yes for this start at dismantling Obamacare. Do you mind explaining both your family circumstances and also your yes vote on the AHCA yesterday?
Well, sure. So I am a proud mom of 3 kids. Our 10-year-old, Cole, was born with an extra 21st chromosome, more commonly known as Down syndrome, which gives me a perspective like thousands, millions of others across the country, but having a child with disabilities and being very concerned about health care and making sure that he's going to have the health care that he needs. And bottom line, that is what we want for every person in this country, is a better health care future, and we trust people rather than the federal government to make the best decisions for themselves. So the bill that passed the House yesterday, it's keeping our promise to the American people to replace Obamacare, but because we want a system that puts people in control of their health care decisions, not the federal government, and that's the goal. And I believe it is better for every person. It is about bringing down premiums, giving people more choices that will meet the needs of themselves and their families. And Obamacare has not fulfilled its promises, and you've heard it, but the premiums continue to increase. The co-pays, the deductibles that are making health care inaccessible. 1 out of 3 counties in America only have one plan available, and so we must do better. We have to do better for every person in this country.
Now, Congresswoman, you know that your colleagues from the Democrat Party are running around saying, well, here the Republicans have just abandoned everybody with a pre-existing condition. Now, I want your unvarnished opinion about those people saying those things when you know that this plan sets aside billions of dollars to provide for people like Cole Rogers, your son.
That's right. It's simply false. And I'm very upset that people are being frightened. They're confused. It's creating a lot of fear when it's not true. There's no circumstance. They're talking about the state seeking the waiver. No state under any circumstance can ever obtain a waiver for guaranteed issue of coverage, guaranteed renewability of that coverage, or the prohibition on denying coverage due to a pre-existing condition. So that isn't even waivable. What the final bill allowed was for states to seek a waiver from some federal mandates. I compare it to the Medicaid waiver that states currently have. And this is what we want the laboratories of democracy to be able to work, right? We want the states to be able to be empowered to set up their own systems and structures that will best meet the needs of the people in their states. And I believe that states can set up structures that will result in better outcomes at a lower cost. But even with that waiver, the pre-existing condition protections are not one that can be waived. There was a concern raised, and this is what the opposition is really grabbing onto over, someone that might move from state to state or change jobs, and so they thought there might be some that would slip through the cracks. That's where we came in with that final amendment, the $8 billion and the protections for those transition individuals that might find themselves in that situation. And I would just emphasize again, this is only for a state that is seeking waivers from the federal government, and they have to meet a lot of requirements to do that. They have to have a high-risk pool. They have to have premiums at a certain level. But we set up we went in there again with an amendment. It was the Upton Amendment. I supported this amendment that allowed or provided more protections, and the $8 billion to make sure that premiums did not go above a certain level for those with pre-existing conditions.
Here's my concern, Congresswoman, and that is we're told this is the first step, and there will be more. But I'm concerned that you've got another budget to write before September, and then you've got an election year coming up next year, and I'm wondering, when do we get to steps 2, 3, and however many it takes to strip out the rest of this disaster called Obamacare?
Well, we've already done some. We've already started the work on the next steps. The next steps are the legislation to allow for across state lines, to allow for the association health plans, continue to expand the health savings accounts, the legislation to address medical liability reform. So those are all additional steps. We'll need the Senate to take action on this first bill. But the House is going to continue to work on these other aspects that are a part of a better health care future for everyone in this country.
Well, and why couldn't we get, for instance, the association healthcare? I know that sometimes these are buzzwords on Capitol Hill. I want people to understand this, and tell me if I'm wrong. Let's say all of the wheat farmers in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho said, we're all having to buy on the individual marketplace. Why don't we form an association of wheat growers or use an existing association where we're already represented in our field, and no pun intended, and say we'd like to get together as a group, and then we can get even better premiums. How come that couldn't be part of this plan?
Well, that's exactly the goal for our wheat growers and other associations. We used a tool called reconciliation on phase 1, and the advantage of reconciliation is that it only requires 50 votes in the Senate, and it's a tool. It's a once-a-year tool tied to the budget. The limitations of reconciliation is that you can only include policy that has an impact on the federal budget or deficits. And association health plans doesn't directly impact the federal budget. So we were able to add like health savings accounts, the expansion of health savings accounts, because there was a federal nexus there. Federal budget nexus, but we were limited to only issues that were tied to the federal budget.
So in other words, and at that point, when do we expect the next one? Because am I right in assuming that we're not going to see a lot of controversial legislation attempted once we get to next year and we're in the middle of an election season?
Well, I think it's important that we just keep every day passing as much as we possibly can. So we need to continue to move on health care. I'm excited to get to tax reform. I'm excited to get to budget reform. We need an entire new budget process within the federal government. And our goal is to get tax reform out of the House by August and then move to budget reform in the fall.
Why does all of this take so long? Can you tell me?
It's the legislative process. It is. It's the legislative process, and
well, I mean, how about changing it? I understand you got to write a bill, then you take it to committee, then it gets added amendments, then they wrangle with it forever, then it finally gets out of committee, it goes to the floor, and then it goes to the Senate, and they do the same thing, and they complicate it some more, and then you have a conference committee. I mean, listen, if Amazon or Boeing or Intel or Nike worked this way, they'd all be out of business, wouldn't they? Wouldn't they?
Well, I'm the first to say that we should be, I believe we should be looking at reforms, congressional reforms to the rules in which govern the House and the Senate. But I also believe that the legislative process is very important, and I know you do too.
Well, I do.
Laid out in the Constitution where it gives people the ability to have input through their representatives, through the committee process, and all of that is very important as you are making these decisions.
But it also allows the other side to say, hey, if we can run the clock out on this thing and get to 2018, and then we'll get to where people don't want to, take a hard position on something because they're up against re-election in the fall of 2018. It's the kind of thing that jams things up. And you know that as we're talking right now, there are business owners and people out there with businesses who'd like to hire more employees. They'd like to do all these things, but they don't know what their tax bill's going to be. And until they know what this new tax reform is going to do to them, many of them are going to sit tight, keep their cards close to their chest, and they're not going to move as much as they could. I mean, we got a good jobs report today, but it could be so much better if people had clarity about whether or not this is going to happen. And now it's, August, and then maybe we'll react, maybe it'll get passed, maybe it won't. So you're leaving not you personally, but the 535 of you are leaving America in limbo, and it means job opportunities that could be created right now are not happening. Is there any faster way to jam this through?
You make a very important point. I think it's a very important point. We must every day be wise and be using our time wisely. And there is an organized effort by the left through Indivisible, Move On, Working Families, and their whole campaign is one to distract us, use up our time. You know, that's where they're flooding our offices with calls. They're asking for all these meetings and all these questions. I mean, their whole purpose, part of their strategy is to run down the clock, right? It is to tie us up rather than allowing us to actually do the work that we want to do on these major issues, once in a generation opportunity to reform health care and tax reform and budget reform. And I think you make a very important point, and we must impress upon people not to get distracted by some of the noise and stay focused on our goal.
Well, they'll make lots of noise. I just wish we could, kind of kick them to the curb and say, look, we got business to get done here. There are people who want jobs, and there are opportunities out there that could be had. Congresswoman, it is a pleasure to have you on the program.
Great to be with you.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rogers, who represents the 5th Congressional District on the eastern side of Washington.